She was just 16, with dreams of college and a future that sparkled as bright as her smile. Sarah Yarborough kissed her parents goodbye that December morning, promising to be home after her drill team competition. She never came home. Instead, her parents received the phone call that shatters every parent's world. Their daughter was found dead, brutally murdered just steps from her high school. But here's what will haunt you. Her killer didn't just murder Sarah and disappear into the night. He destroyed her in broad daylight, with witnesses watching, leaving behind his DNA like breadcrumbs for police to follow. This wasn't a perfect crime. It was sloppy, reckless, almost arrogant. Yet somehow, this monster vanished completely, leaving investigators staring at rock-solid evidence that led absolutely nowhere. For 28 excruciating years, Sarah's family lived in a special kind of hell, knowing her killer was out there, free, possibly watching the news coverage of their pain, maybe even attending her memorial services. Every family photo became a reminder of the daughter who would never age, never graduate, never give them grandchildren. Then one breakthrough changed everything, revealing a predator so dangerous, so violent, that when you learn his identity, you'll understand why this case will keep you awake tonight. Don't let the resolution of Sarah Yarborough's cold case fade into silence. Subscribe now to uncover the shocking truth behind how justice was finally served. Ignore this, and you'll be turning your back on the hard-fought justice that Sarah's family waited decades to receive. Subscribe now, unless you're okay with letting the truth go unnoticed. To understand the true horror of what was stolen that December morning, you need to know who Sarah Yarborough really was. Not just another victim in a case file, but a vibrant teenager whose laughter could light up any room she entered. Sarah wasn't just popular, she was genuinely loved by everyone who knew her. At Federal Way High School, she moved through the hallways like sunshine, stopping to encourage a struggling classmate, celebrating a friend's success, or simply making someone's day better with her infectious smile. Her teachers didn't just see an honors student. They saw a young woman who asked thoughtful questions, who stayed after class to help others understand difficult concepts, who treated everyone with the same warmth, whether they were the star quarterback or the shy kid eating lunch alone. Her drill team wasn't just an extracurricular activity, it was her passion. Sarah poured her heart into every routine, every practice, every competition. She arrived early and stayed late, perfecting her moves, encouraging teammates who struggled, and bringing an energy that lifted the entire team. Her coaches saw something special in Sarah, not just talent but leadership, dedication, and a rare ability to make others believe in themselves. At home, Sarah was the daughter every parent dreams of having. She helped her younger brothers with homework without being asked, called her grandparents just to chat, and still curled up with her parents on the couch to watch movies. Her bedroom walls were covered with college brochures and acceptance letters. She had her pick of universities, each one eager to welcome this remarkable young woman who seemed destined for greatness. Tom and Laura Yarborough watched their eldest daughter bloom into everything they'd hoped for and more. Sarah talked constantly about her future, the psychology degree she wanted to earn, the children she hoped to help, the difference she planned to make in the world. Her dreams weren't just fantasies. They were detailed plans backed by the grades, character, and determination to make them reality. Her two younger brothers worshipped their big sister. She wasn't just family. She was their protector, their cheerleader, their role model. Sarah taught them to tie their shoes, helped them with school projects, and defended them fiercely against neighborhood bullies. They felt invincible with Sarah in their corner. The Yarborough family had built something beautiful together, a home filled with laughter, support, and unconditional love. Sarah was their bright center, the daughter and sister who made everything feel possible. who reminded them daily that goodness still existed in the world. But evil was watching Sarah too. Someone had noticed this radiant teenager, had seen her kindness as vulnerability, her trust as opportunity. While Sarah planned her future and spread joy to everyone around her, a predator was planning something unspeakable. What happened next would shatter not just the Yarborough family, but an entire community that thought monsters only existed in nightmares, until one December morning, when they learned that sometimes the most beautiful lights attract the darkest shadows. Evil had been watching Sarah, and on December 14th it finally struck. Sarah stepped out of her car that crisp morning, her drill team bag slung over her shoulder, completely unaware that a predator had been studying her routine, waiting for this exact moment. The parking lot stretched empty around her. No witnesses, no protection, just a 16-year-old girl walking toward what she thought was another normal day at school. She never made it through the front doors. What happened next unfolded in those terrifying minutes when screams go unheard and help feels impossibly far away. Someone grabbed Sarah, someone who had been planning this moment, who knew exactly when she would be most vulnerable. Her drill team uniform, the one she had worn with such pride just hours before, became the tool of her destruction as she was dragged away from safety into the woods where no one could hear her fight for her life. Two boys cutting through the trees behind the school stumbled upon a scene that would shatter their innocence forever. They saw scattered clothing first, then the horrible realization of what lay beneath the winter branches. Their screams pierced the morning air, a sound so raw and desperate that everyone who heard it knew something unspeakable had happened. Sarah lay broken in the underbrush, her young body bearing the brutal evidence of what this monster had done to her. She had been strangled with her own stockings, the very uniform that represented her dreams and achievements twisted into an instrument of death. The medical examiner's report would later reveal the full scope of the horror: sexual assault followed by murder, a teenager's life snuffed out by someone who saw her not as a human being, but as prey. The location itself told a story of calculated evil. Sarah would never have gone into those woods willingly. She had been forced there, dragged away from the safety of the school parking lot to a place where her attacker could do whatever he wanted without interruption. The distance from her car to where she died painted a horrifying picture of her final moments, moments filled with terror, desperation, and the crushing realization that no one was coming to save her. But here's what makes this crime even more chilling. It happened in broad daylight, just yards from Federal Way High School. While Sarah was fighting for her life, students were arriving for classes, teachers were preparing for the day. Life was continuing normally just feet away from where the most heinous evil was unfolding. Her killer had been so brazen, so confident, that he committed this atrocity practically on school property, with hundreds of potential witnesses nearby. The crime scene should have been this monster's downfall. He had left behind everything investigators needed to identify and arrest him: DNA evidence on Sarah's clothing, witness descriptions of a suspicious man fleeing the area, physical evidence that clearly showed what had happened. This wasn't a perfect crime. It was sloppy, risky, almost arrogant in its execution. What investigators found at the scene would haunt them for decades. Not because the evidence was lacking, but because it was almost too perfect, too complete, as if Sarah's killer wanted to be caught. But sometimes, having all the right pieces of a puzzle means nothing when the picture they create leads you into a void where monsters learn to hide in plain sight, and justice becomes a race against time that would take 28 years to win. Sometimes having all the evidence in the world means nothing when you're hunting a ghost. Detective after detective stared at Sarah's case file, each one convinced they would be the one to crack it. The evidence was overwhelming, crystal clear DNA from the killer, multiple witness statements, a detailed composite sketch that captured his face with startling accuracy. Every textbook said this case should have been solved within weeks. Instead, it became the investigation that broke careers and haunted dreams. The first detective assigned to Sarah's case worked 18-hour days, following every lead with the desperate intensity of someone who knew time was slipping away. He knocked on thousands of doors, showed the composite sketch to anyone who would look, collected DNA samples from every suspicious male in the area. His desk became a shrine to Sarah's memory, her school photo watching over stacks of tips, witness statements, and laboratory reports that seemed to mock him with their clarity. When that detective retired without solving the case, the guilt nearly destroyed him. He would wake up in cold sweats, seeing Sarah's face, hearing her parents' voices, asking when their daughter's killer would finally pay. He passed the case to a younger detective, apologizing for his failure, warning him that Sarah's killer was unlike anything he'd ever hunted before. The second detective approached the case with fresh eyes and renewed determination. He re-interviewed every witness, re-examined every piece of evidence, used new technology to enhance the composite sketch. He was certain modern techniques would reveal what his predecessor had missed. But months turned into years, and the case file only grew thicker, while the leads grew colder. The DNA profile sat in database after database, waiting for a match that never came. The composite sketch was distributed to police departments across the country, generating hundreds of tips that led nowhere. Psychics called, claiming to have visions of the killer. Well-meaning citizens reported suspicious neighbors. Sex offenders were hauled in for questioning and quickly released when their DNA didn't match. Meanwhile, the Yarborough family lived in a special kind of hell. Every phone call from the police sent their hearts racing with hope, only to be crushed when detectives delivered the same devastating news. No arrests, no new leads, no justice for Sarah. Tom and Laura aged years in months, their marriage straining under the weight of grief and frustration. Their two sons grew up watching their parents wait by the phone, clinging to the belief that someone, somewhere, would finally give them answers. The community lived in fear, knowing Sarah's killer was still out there. Parents walked their children to school, installed new locks, looked over their shoulders in parking lots. The killer had proven he could strike anywhere, anytime, and disappear without a trace. Federal Way felt like a town under siege by an invisible enemy. As years became decades, the case changed hands again and again. Each new detective brought fresh hope that quickly curdled into familiar despair. The evidence never changed. It remained as clear and compelling as the day Sarah died. But somehow, it pointed to a man who seemed to exist only in witness descriptions and DNA profiles, never in real life. The case files filled multiple boxes. The composite sketch yellowed with age. The DNA profile was entered into every new database that came online, each time generating the same crushing result. No match found. Sarah's killer had achieved the impossible. He had committed a nearly perfect crime while leaving behind nearly perfect evidence. By 2018, 27 years after Sarah's murder, even the most optimistic detectives had begun to accept the unthinkable, that Sarah's killer might take his secret to the grave. But sometimes the very technology that failed you for decades becomes the weapon that changes everything. And in 2019, a revolutionary new tool would finally drag Sarah's monster out of the shadows and into the light. Sometimes the answer to your prayers comes disguised as science fiction. In 2019, Detective Jim Scharf inherited Sarah's case with the same grim determination that had consumed his predecessors, but unlike the detectives before him, Scharf had access to something that seemed almost magical: forensic genetic genealogy. This revolutionary technique promised to do what 28 years of traditional detective work couldn't: transform Sarah's killer's DNA from a dead end into a roadmap leading straight to his identity. The concept was deceptively simple, yet breathtakingly complex. Instead of waiting for Sarah's killer to commit another crime, or hoping he would voluntarily submit his DNA to a database, investigators could now use his genetic material to build his family tree. Public genealogy websites had exploded in popularity, with millions of people uploading their DNA to discover their ancestry. Scharf contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specialized in this cutting-edge technique. The process would take Scharf's killer's DNA profile and compare it against the genetic information of hundreds of thousands of people who had voluntarily uploaded their data to genealogy websites. Even distant relatives, third cousins, great-great-grandparents, family members who had never heard of Sarah Yarborough, could provide the genetic breadcrumbs needed to identify her killer. But this wasn't a quick computer search that would spit out a name in minutes. Genetic genealogists had to become digital detectives, painstakingly building family trees going back generations, following genetic matches through marriage records, birth certificates, death notices, and census data. Each potential lead required hours of meticulous research, cross-referencing DNA percentages with family relationships, eliminating innocent relatives while closing in on the killer. For months, the genealogists worked in secret, building massive family trees that sprawled across computer screens like spiderwebs of human connection. Sarah's family had no idea that their daughter's case was finally moving forward. They had been disappointed too many times to allow themselves hope over what seemed like another long shot. The breakthrough came when genealogists identified a cluster of genetic matches pointing to specific family lines. They worked backward through generations, tracking births, deaths, marriages, and movements across states and decades. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of a family tree that contained Sarah's killer somewhere within its branches. As the genealogists narrowed their focus, one name began to emerge from the genetic maze: Patrick Leon Nicholas. Born in 1964, he would have been 27 at the time of Sarah's murder, exactly the right age to match witness descriptions. But, more importantly, his genetic profile aligned perfectly with the DNA evidence collected from Sarah's clothing 28 years earlier. Detective Scharf felt his pulse quicken as he began investigating Nicholas. This wasn't just another name on a list of suspects. This was a man with a violent criminal history, someone who had attacked women before, someone who fit the profile of Sarah's killer in ways that were too precise to be coincidental. But having a name wasn't enough. Scharf needed confirmation, and that meant getting a fresh DNA sample from Nicholas without alerting him to the investigation. The detective began surveillance, waiting for the perfect opportunity to collect evidence that would either confirm Nicholas as Sarah's killer or eliminate him as a suspect. The moment came when Nicholas discarded a cigarette outside his workplace. Scharf watched from across the street as the man who might be Sarah's killer casually tossed away the evidence that could finally bring him to justice. The cigarette was carefully collected and rushed to the laboratory for analysis. The wait for results felt eternal. Sarah's parents, still unaware of the breakthrough, continued their daily routine of grief and hope. The Federal Way community remained in the dark about how close investigators were to finally solving their most infamous cold case. When the laboratory results came back, Detective Scharf stared at the report with trembling hands. The DNA from Nicholas's cigarette was a perfect match to the genetic evidence found on Sarah's body 28 years earlier. After nearly 3 decades of hunting a ghost, investigators finally had their monster. But what they discovered about Patrick Leon Nicholas would reveal a truth so disturbing that it would haunt everyone who learned it. This killer should never have been free to murder Sarah in the first place. The monster finally had a face, and it was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Patrick Leon Nicholas wasn't some mysterious criminal who had managed to stay off law enforcement's radar. He was a predator the system knew intimately, a violent offender whose rap sheet read like a blueprint for escalating brutality against women. When Detective Scharf pulled Nicholas's criminal history, he felt sick to his stomach, not just because of what Nicholas had done, but because of what the system had allowed him to do. In 1987, Nicholas had been convicted of attempted rape. The victim was a young woman who barely escaped with her life after Nicholas attacked her with the same calculated violence he would later use on Sarah. The courts sentenced him to 10 years in prison, a decade that should have kept him locked away, unable to hurt anyone else. But the system failed Sarah before she ever knew she was in danger. Nicholas served only 3 years and 4 months of his 10-year sentence. In 1990, he walked out of prison a free man, his debt to society supposedly paid, his rehabilitation supposedly complete. The parole board had decided this violent predator was ready to rejoin the community, ready to be trusted around women, ready to live peacefully among families like the Yarboroughs. They were catastrophically wrong. Less than 2 years after his early release, Nicholas spotted Sarah in that Federal Way High School parking lot. The same hand that had attacked his previous victim, the same mind that had planned that brutal assault, now focused on a 16-year-old girl whose only crime was being in the wrong place when a monster was prowling. The cruel mathematics of the situation were devastating. If Nicholas had served his full 10-year sentence, he would have been behind bars on December 14, 1991. Sarah would have arrived at school that morning, attended her drill team competition, and gone home to her family for dinner. She would have graduated, gone to college, fallen in love, had children of her own, an entire life that was stolen not just by Nicholas, but by a system that believed a violent sexual predator could be reformed in less than 4 years. One of Nicholas's earlier victims would later testify about the haunting parallels between her attack and Sarah's murder. The same pattern of stalking, the same brutal methods, the same complete lack of remorse afterward. She had survived Nicholas's violence and tried to rebuild her life, never knowing that her attacker would be released early to destroy another family. Nicholas hadn't just been free when he killed Sarah. He had been emboldened by a system that had essentially told him his violent crimes against women weren't serious enough to warrant a full prison sentence. He had learned that he could attack women and expect minimal consequences, that society would give him second chances, even when his victims never got first chances at recovery. But Nicholas had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated how much the world would change in 28 years. And how determined people would become to make him pay for what he had done to Sarah. When Detective Scharf knocked on Nicholas' door to place him under arrest, the monster who had haunted Federal Way for nearly 3 decades was about to discover that some crimes can never be escaped, no matter how much time passes. After 28 years of waiting, the moment Sarah's family had dreamed of finally arrived. But nothing could have prepared them for the emotional devastation of facing their daughter's killer in court. Tom and Laura Yarborough walked into that courtroom carrying nearly 3 decades of grief, rage, and desperate hope for justice. They had aged from young parents into grandparents while Nicholas lived freely, and now they had to sit just feet away from the monster who had destroyed their world. Laura clutched Sarah's photo against her chest, her hands shaking as she stared at the man who had stolen her daughter's future. Nicholas sat at the defense table with an arrogance that made Sarah's family sick. This was the face that had been hidden for 28 years, the predator who had walked among them while they suffered. He showed no remorse, no recognition of the devastation he had caused, no acknowledgement that he had murdered a 16-year-old girl whose only crime was being vulnerable when he was hunted. The prosecution methodically destroyed Nicholas's world piece by piece. They presented the DNA evidence that had finally exposed him, the witness testimony that placed him at the scene, the forensic evidence that proved beyond any doubt that he had sexually assaulted and murdered Sarah. Each piece of evidence felt like another nail in his coffin, another step toward the justice the Yarborough family had been denied for so long. When Nicholas's earlier victim took the stand to describe her own attack, the courtroom fell silent. Her testimony revealed the chilling pattern of his violence, the escalation that had led inevitably to Sarah's murder. She looked directly at Nicholas as she spoke, her voice strong despite the pain of reliving her trauma. She had survived his brutality, and now she was helping to ensure he would never hurt another woman. The jury deliberated for hours that felt like years to Sarah's family. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all charges, first-degree murder with sexual motivation and second-degree murder, Laura Yarborough collapsed into her husband's arms. 28 years of held breath finally released in sobs that echoed through the courtroom. The judge sentenced Nicholas to 45 years in prison, but the number felt both satisfying and hollow. 45 years couldn't restore Sarah's life, couldn't give her parents back their daughter, couldn't undo the decades of torment her family had endured. As Nicholas was led away in handcuffs, Sarah's family finally had their justice. But they were about to discover that closure and healing were two very different things. The courtroom victory was just the beginning of a new chapter for the Yarborough family and the Federal Way community, one that would test whether justice truly can heal wounds that have festered for nearly 3 decades. Justice had been served, but the Yarborough family was about to learn that healing from 28 years of trauma doesn't happen overnight. In the weeks following Nicholas's conviction, Federal Way felt like a town exhaling after holding its breath for decades. Parents who had clutched their children closer since 1991 finally allowed themselves to believe the monster was gone. The high school held a memorial service for Sarah, attended by classmates who were now middle-aged adults with children of their own. They shared stories of the bright teenager they remembered, tears flowing for the friend they had lost, and the future she never got to live. But for Tom and Laura Yarborough, the victory felt strangely hollow. They had spent nearly 3 decades believing that catching Sarah's killer would somehow make everything better, that justice would magically restore what they had lost. Instead, they found themselves facing a new kind of grief, the realization that no court verdict could bring back their daughter or erase the years of anguish they had endured. Sarah's brothers, now grown men with families of their own, struggled with complex emotions. They felt relief that their sister's killer was finally behind bars, but also anger that it had taken so long, that their childhood had been overshadowed by this tragedy, that their own children would grow up knowing their aunt only through photographs and stories. The detectives who had worked Sarah's case over the years gathered for an informal memorial, sharing memories of the investigation that had consumed so many of their careers. Some had retired without seeing justice. Others had transferred to different departments, carrying Sarah's unsolved case like a weight on their souls. Detective Scharf, who had finally brought Nicholas to justice, admitted that solving the case felt both triumphant and heartbreaking. The conviction sparked conversations throughout the community about early release policies, about how the system had failed Sarah by allowing Nicholas to walk free. Advocacy groups seized on the case as evidence that violent predators rarely reform, that early parole for sexual assault convictions puts innocent people at risk. Local news stations ran retrospective pieces about the case, interviewing neighbors who remembered the fear that had gripped Federal Way for years. Many admitted they still checked their locks twice, still walked their children to school, still felt a chill when they passed the woods where Sarah had died. But perhaps the most profound impact of Nicholas's conviction wasn't felt in Federal Way at all. It was felt in crime labs and police departments across the country, where other cold cases were about to be reopened with new hope. Sarah Yarborough's case had become more than just a story of justice delayed. It had become a blueprint for how science could finally give voice to the silenced and peace to those who had waited far too long for answers. Sarah Yarborough's story proves that some voices refuse to be silenced, even decades after they've been stolen from us. Her case became a beacon of hope for families across the country who refuse to let their loved ones become forgotten statistics. The forensic genetic genealogy breakthrough that solved Sarah's murder has since helped crack hundreds of other cold cases, bringing closure to families who thought they would never see justice. Sarah's legacy isn't just about the monster who killed her or the technology that caught him. It's about a family's refusal to give up, a community's determination to remember, and a justice system that finally evolved to match the evil it was fighting. Every cold case solved using these new methods carries a piece of Sarah's story forward. Her parents still visit her grave regularly, no longer carrying the crushing weight of unanswered questions. They finally have peace, knowing their daughter's killer will die behind bars. Don't let Sarah's story end here. Subscribe to ensure more cold case victims get the justice they deserve. There are thousands of families still waiting for answers, still hoping for closure. Your support helps us tell their stories and keeps pressure on law enforcement to never give up. Subscribe now, because every victim deserves to be remembered, and every family deserves the truth.